So I think we've used for many years arterial stents in the venous space, and the engineering requirements for dealing with veins are completely different from the arteries. So I always like to say dealing with the arteries is like playing tennis, dealing with the veins is like playing squash. They're both racket sports with a ball, but they have different rules and different requirements. And if you keep taking the same techniques from one to the other without changing them, you're not going to get a good result. So, playing with a tennis forehand on the squash court means somebody leaves with a broken nose. And I think that's what happens to the patients that we deal with if you use arterial-based techniques in the veins. So venous-specific stents mean we have things now that have been very carefully, very considered and designed with the requirements of the venous space in mind. And I think Abre and the engineering team are to be congratulated. They've spent a lot of time thinking on this device, and it deals with a lot of the requirements we need. So that, in addition to all the other stents that are on the market at the moment, mean Venous really has specific tools now for the first time that mean we should see a translatable benefit for patients, which is ultimately the objective. So at the moment, I don't think we have a significant amount of data that allows us to choose between stents and performance, but Abre is a open cell nitinol stent, as we know, which has got really good attributes from that side of flexibility, and particularly under the ligament. I think there's going to be advantages for that stent. It's very easy to use, good range of sizes and lengths. So I think it adds to what we have already, a balanced, rounded option for treating the vast majority of patients that we have with a very easy to use, effective stent. The data that was presented at VEITH is data on the demographic aspects of the patient population in the Abre study. And the interesting thing when you compare across the ID studies that have been released so far, which are the VEITH study from Bard, VEITH study, which is Boston Scientific, and we still await the results from the Cook-Zilver Venous study, but we've seen the OUS population, is that this group of patients are very clearly divided into acute DVT and NIVL patients and post-thrombotic patients, which are the groups of patients that most people treat. And that gives us an ability to understand how the stent performs across those three patient groups. And that's the most, I think, notable feature of how this study was set up, learning from the experience of the trials that have gone before. We will also see, I think, a clear issue of extension of the stent below the inguinal ligament, which allows us to understand how the Abre stent will perform in that region. The VEITH study, for example, only had extension of stents below the ligament in approximately 3% of patients. So it's very difficult to understand how that performed in comparison to VEITH, where there was a considerable population of patients with extensive disease treated. So we can see some demographic differences that hopefully will come out in some aspects of performance of the stent that will allow us to know where all of these stents sit relative to each other. Well, we've completed 12-month follow-up of those patients, so the hope is that we will present the full data set or the highlights of that full data set in the foreseeable future. That will give us an insight into the performance of the stent, and in the long term, we need to see what these devices do over a number of years. So I think we're going to see all that data starting to come out. I think some of the other aspects that we built into Abre study, which are key, is the use of IVUS and venography in all the patients, which mirrors VEITH to some extent, but allows us to have a very robust data set to analyze the performance of the stent. We also will be able to look at some of the aspects of why stents don't perform well, for example, and oftentimes we found that that's not the stent. There's aspects of how you do the procedure that people need to learn from. So we hope that we can educate the appropriate way to use venous stents in the future. We can't forget that wall stent has got more data supporting it than any other stent that there is on the market, and I think that to the fact of its longevity means that there will always be a role for wall stent. Where that finds its place is still to be determined. I use the wall stent in patients where we have problems with inguinal ligament stent fractures, for example, which is clearly been a place for it. We haven't seen any fractures with the Abre yet, but I think that at the end of the day, the wall stent will undoubtedly have a role. The limitations in the wall stent have been length. The maximum length is 90 millimeters, and the nitinol stents replace that. And some of the issues we've had with extending stent into the IVC and causing contralateral limb DVT, and some of the difficulties that you get from wall stent with deployment and ease of use. So the nitinol stents address all of those features. So I fully expect nitinol stents to supersede the wall stent in use, but it will undoubtedly still have some place in the management of venous patients, given the length of time that it's been used for and the different characteristics that a wall stent has over the nitinol stents.